27 years after Princess Diana's tragic death, Kensington Palace holds secrets that refuse to stay buried. What happens when the past refuses to rest, and the most guarded room in the royal residence becomes the center of an impossible mystery? Security guard Thomas Mitchell thought he knew every corner, every shadow, every sound of the palace he'd protected for over a decade. But on a cold October night in 2024, he would discover that some rooms hold more than memories. They hold presences that defy explanation. This is the true account of 3 nights that shook the very foundations of what we believe about life, death, and the unbreakable bonds between a mother and her children. A story that palace officials tried desperately to suppress. But the truth has a way of finding the light. What Thomas witnessed in Diana's former private quarters wasn't just paranormal. It was a revelation that would change everything the world thought it knew about the people's princess and the legacy she left behind. Thomas Mitchell pulled his collar up against the October chill as he began his evening rounds at Kensington Palace. The autumn of 2024 had been particularly cold, and the ancient stone walls seemed to absorb every degree of warmth from the air. At 52, Thomas had been walking these corridors for 12 years, ever since his retirement from the Metropolitan Police. He knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft that whistled through the windows, every shadow cast by the ornate fixtures that lined the halls. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air that he couldn't quite place, a tension that made the hair on his arms stand up beneath his uniform. He checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. The palace was quiet except for the distant hum of the heating system and the occasional footsteps of his colleague Sarah, who was patrolling the East Wing. Thomas had always been assigned to the West Wing, which housed some of the most historically significant rooms in the palace. Among them was the suite that had once belonged to Princess Diana during her marriage to Prince Charles. The rooms had been sealed since her death in 1997, occasionally opened for maintenance but otherwise left untouched as a private memorial that the public never saw. As he approached the corridor leading to Diana's former quarters, Thomas noticed something unusual. The heavy wooden door at the end of the hall, which should have been locked and alarmed, was slightly ajar. A thin line of pale light seeped through the crack, casting an ethereal glow on the burgundy carpet. His training kicked in immediately. Thomas reached for his radio to call for backup, but hesitated. False alarms were taken seriously at the palace, and if this turned out to be nothing more than a maintenance oversight, he'd face questions he didn't want to answer. He decided to investigate first. Moving quietly down the corridor, Thomas approached the door with practiced caution. The light inside wasn't the harsh fluorescent lighting used by the maintenance crews. It was softer, warmer, almost like candlelight. As he drew closer, he could hear something that made his blood run cold. The faint sound of a woman's voice, speaking in hushed tones. Thomas pressed himself against the wall beside the doorframe and listened. The voice was elegant, refined, with the distinctive accent he recognized from countless news broadcasts and documentaries. But that was impossible. The woman who once owned that voice had been dead for 27 years. "My darlings," the voice whispered, "I know you can't hear me, but I need you to know I'm still here. I've never left you, not really." Thomas's hands shook as he peered through the crack in the door. What he saw defied every rational explanation his police training had taught him to seek. In the center of the room, bathed in that inexplicable warm light, stood a translucent figure. She was tall and graceful, wearing the kind of elegant dress Diana had favored during her public appearances. Her blonde hair caught the light as she moved, and though her form was ethereal, her presence filled the room with an undeniable sense of love and longing. The figure moved to a large mahogany desk near the window, where 2 framed photographs sat side by side. Even from his position by the door, Thomas could see they were pictures of William and Harry as young boys. The apparition reached toward the photos with hands that seemed to shimmer like moonlight on water. "William, my sensitive boy," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of years of unspoken words. "You've grown into such a wonderful man, such a devoted father. I see so much of your grandfather in you, that sense of duty, that quiet strength. But I worry about the weight you carry. Please don't let the crown dim the light in your eyes the way it did for so many before you." Thomas found himself completely mesmerized, his rational mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. He had investigated countless cases during his police career, had seen things that would haunt most people's nightmares, but nothing had prepared him for this. The figure turned toward the other photograph, and her voice took on a different tone, still loving, but tinged with concern and regret. "And Harry, my wild, passionate boy, your heart is so big, so full of love and pain in equal measure. I know you're angry, I know you feel lost and betrayed. But please remember that sometimes the greatest act of courage is forgiveness, even when it feels impossible." As the apparition spoke, the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop several degrees. Thomas's breath formed small clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself. But the cold wasn't uncomfortable. It was somehow comforting, like a gentle embrace. The figure began to move around the room, touching objects that had once been part of her daily life. A jewelry box that had been left on the dresser, a silk scarf draped over a chair, books that still sat on the nightstand with bookmarks tucked between their pages. Each item seemed to glow briefly under her touch, as if responding to some invisible energy. "They think I don't know what's happening," she said, her voice growing stronger. "They think death means silence, means absence. But love doesn't die, does it? Love finds a way to transcend even the greatest barriers. And my love for my boys, for the family I fought so hard to protect and change, that love is stronger than anything this world or the next can throw at it." Thomas realized he was crying. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he witnessed this impossible reunion between a mother and the memory of her children. He thought of his own daughter, Sarah, and how he would move heaven and earth to comfort her if she needed him, even from beyond the grave. The apparition moved to the window that overlooked the palace gardens, where Diana had often been photographed walking or playing with William and Harry during happier times. She pressed her translucent palm against the glass, and for a moment, the window seemed to shimmer with the same ethereal light that surrounded her. "The world thinks they know my story," she said, her voice now directed outward, as if she knew someone was listening. "They think it ended in Paris, in that tunnel, with twisted metal and broken glass. But that was just the beginning. Death isn't an ending when you have unfinished business, when the people you love most are still struggling with wounds you helped create." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Was she speaking to him? Could she somehow sense his presence? "I've watched my boys grow into men, watched them love and lose and find their way in a world that never gave them a choice about who they wanted to be. I've seen them struggle with my legacy, with the questions that will never have answers, with the guilt and anger and confusion that comes from losing a parent so young." The figure turned from the window, and for a heart-stopping moment, Thomas thought she was looking directly at him. Her eyes, those unmistakable blue eyes that had captivated the world, seemed to see right through the crack in the door and into his soul. "But tonight is different," she continued. "Tonight, I'm not just watching. Tonight, I'm going to try to reach them, to let them know that their mother's love didn't die in that car. It's here, it's real, and it's stronger now than it ever was when I was alive." The light around her began to intensify, growing brighter and more focused. Thomas could feel energy crackling in the air like the moments before a thunderstorm. The very walls seemed to vibrate with an invisible force that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Suddenly, the apparition raised her hands, and the light exploded outward in a pulse that Thomas felt in his chest like a physical blow. Every electronic device in the corridor, his radio, his flashlight, his watch, died instantly. The emergency lighting flickered and went out, plunging the hallway into complete darkness, except for the supernatural glow emanating from Diana's room. In that moment of brilliant illumination, Thomas saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The figure of Diana wasn't alone. Standing behind her, barely visible but undeniably present, were the outlines of two other figures. They were taller, more solid, and they seemed to be guarding her, protecting her as she worked whatever impossible magic she was attempting to perform. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light faded. The room fell into darkness, and the only sound in the corridor was Thomas's ragged breathing and the hammering of his heart. He stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, waiting for something else to happen, for some sign that what he had witnessed was real. When he finally found the courage to push the door open and step into the room, it was empty. The photographs still sat on the desk, the personal items remained in their places, but there was no sign of the supernatural encounter he had just witnessed. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was the faint scent of Diana's favorite perfume, white linen by Estee Lauder, lingering in the air like a whispered goodbye. Thomas's electronic equipment flickered back to life as he stood in the center of the room, trying to process what had happened. His radio crackled with Sarah's voice calling for a status check, and he realized he had been out of contact for nearly 30 minutes. "All clear in the West Wing," he managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion. Just had some equipment malfunctions. As he prepared to leave the room and continue his rounds, Thomas noticed something that made his blood freeze. On the mahogany desk, next to the photographs of William and Harry, there was a third frame that hadn't been there before. It contained a picture of the two princes as adult men standing with their wives and children, a photo that could only have been taken within the last few years, but the room had been sealed for decades. No one had access except for carefully supervised maintenance crews, and Thomas was certain the frame hadn't been there when he'd last checked the room during his previous shift. He stared at the photograph, his mind reeling with implications he wasn't ready to accept. If what he had witnessed was real, if Diana's spirit truly was reaching out to her sons, then everything he thought he knew about life and death had just been turned upside down. Thomas left the room exactly as he had found it, locking the door and resetting the alarm system. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that somewhere in the shadows of the palace a mother's love was still working to heal wounds that had festered for far too long. He finished his rounds in a daze, his mind replaying every detail of the encounter. When his shift ended at 6 a.m., Thomas drove home to his small flat in North London, but sleep was impossible. He sat at his kitchen table drinking coffee and staring out the window as the sun rose over the city, wondering if he was losing his mind or if he had just witnessed something that would change the world if anyone ever believed him. By the time evening came and it was time to return to work, Thomas had almost convinced himself that the whole thing had been a stress-induced hallucination. The job could be mentally taxing, walking the same corridors night after night, surrounded by centuries of history and tragedy. Maybe his mind had simply created what he wanted to see, what he needed to see, to make sense of the sadness that seemed to permeate the very walls of the palace. But as he approached Kensington Palace for his second night shift, Thomas felt that same electric tension in the air, that same sense of anticipation that had preceded the previous night's encounter. And deep in his gut, he knew that whatever had happened in Diana's room wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The second night arrived with an unseasonable fog that wrapped around Kensington Palace like a shroud. Thomas arrived for his shift an hour early, unable to stay away despite the rational part of his mind, screaming that he should request a transfer to another section of the palace. He had spent the day researching everything he could find about paranormal encounters, trying to find some explanation for what he had witnessed that didn't involve accepting the impossible. Sarah greeted him at the security office with a concerned frown. "You look terrible, Tom." "Rough night last night?" Thomas forced a smile. "Just couldn't sleep. You know how it is with these old buildings, they make strange noises that keep you thinking." Sarah had been working at the palace for 15 years, longer than anyone else on the security team. If anyone would understand what he was going through, it would be her. But how could he possibly explain what he had seen without sounding completely insane? "Actually, speaking of strange noises," Sarah continued, pulling up the security logs on her computer, "we had some unusual electromagnetic readings in the West Wing last night. Around midnight, all the sensors went haywire for about half an hour. The tech guys are saying it was probably solar flare interference, but I've never seen anything like it." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. So there was documented evidence that something unusual had occurred during his encounter with Diana's spirit. He wasn't losing his mind after all. "Did you notice anything during your rounds?" Sarah asked, her sharp eyes studying his face carefully. "Equipment malfunctions," Thomas replied, which was technically true. "Radio went dead, flashlight died. You know how these old electronics can be unreliable." Sarah nodded, but Thomas could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. She had the instincts of a veteran security professional, and she knew when someone wasn't telling her the whole truth. As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself constantly checking the clock and glancing toward the West Wing corridor. The anticipation was almost unbearable, like waiting for a storm that you could feel building in the air but couldn't see approaching. He tried to focus on his normal duties, checking locks, monitoring the security cameras, doing the routine paperwork that kept the palace running smoothly, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that ethereal figure and her heartbreaking words to her absent sons. At 11:30 p.m., Thomas could wait no longer. He started his rounds 30 minutes early, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors as he made his way toward Diana's former quarters. The fog outside had grown thicker, pressing against the windows like ghostly fingers trying to find a way inside. As he approached the familiar corridor, Thomas noticed that the temperature had already begun to drop. His breath misted in the air, and he could feel that same electric charge building that had preceded the previous night's encounter. But this time, there was something different in the atmosphere. A sense of urgency that made his pulse quicken. The door to Diana's room was closed and locked, just as he had left it. But as Thomas drew nearer, he could see that soft, warm light seeping through the crack beneath the door. This time, however, the light was pulsing rhythmically, like a heartbeat made visible. Thomas didn't hesitate. Whatever was happening inside that room was beyond his understanding, but he knew he was meant to witness it. He approached the door and carefully pushed it open, stepping into a scene that was both familiar and startling in its intensity. Diana's spirit was there again, but she was no longer alone in the way she had been the previous night. The room was filled with an energy that made Thomas's skin tingle, and as his eyes adjusted to the supernatural light, he could see that the two shadowy figures he had glimpsed before were now clearly visible. They were men, both tall and distinguished, wearing the formal dress of an earlier era. One had the bearing of a military officer, his posture rigid and commanding even in death. The other was slightly shorter, but carried himself with an air of quiet authority that seemed to fill the space around him. Thomas didn't recognize them, but something about their presence suggested they were connected to the royal family in some way. Diana was standing before a large mirror that dominated one wall of the room, but instead of showing her reflection, the mirror's surface rippled like water, displaying images that seemed to come from different times and places. Thomas watched in amazement as scenes from Diana's life played across the glass surface. Her wedding day, moments with William and Harry as children, charitable visits to hospitals and homeless shelters, private moments of laughter and tears that the world had never seen. "They need to know the truth," Diana was saying to the two figures, her voice carrying a note of desperation that hadn't been there the night before. "All these years, they've carried the guilt and the questions. William thinks he wasn't enough to make me stay. Harry believes his wildness drove me away. They're both wrong, but they'll never heal until they understand what really happened." The military figure stepped forward, his voice deep and resonant with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Diana, dear girl, some truths are too dangerous. The living have their own ways of finding peace. Perhaps it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." Thomas realized with a shock that he was listening to a conversation between the dead, not just Diana, but other members of the royal family who had passed on. The implications were staggering. If spirits could communicate with each other, if there truly was some form of consciousness that survived death, then everything humanity believed about the afterlife might be incomplete or entirely wrong. Diana turned to face the military figure, her ethereal form blazing with an inner light that made Thomas shield his eyes. "Uncle Dickie, you always were too cautious. But this isn't about protecting the monarchy or maintaining proper protocol. This is about my children, and I won't let them suffer because of secrets that died with me." Thomas's mind reeled as he realized he was witnessing a conversation between Diana and Lord Louis Mountbatten, Prince Philip's uncle, who had been killed by an IRA bomb in 1979. The implications were staggering. If the spirits of dead royals were gathering together, if they could influence events in the living world, then the palace was harboring secrets far more extraordinary than anyone had ever imagined. The second figure, whom Thomas now suspected might be King George VI based on his bearing and the time frame, placed a gentle hand on Diana's shoulder. "What are you proposing to do, my dear? The barriers between our world and theirs exist for good reasons. Crossing them comes with consequences that even we don't fully understand." Diana moved away from the mirror and back to the desk where the photographs of her sons waited. As she approached them, the images began to glow with the same ethereal light that surrounded her spirit. I'm going to reach out to them directly, she said, her voice filled with a determination that brooked no argument. Not through dreams or vague signs that they can dismiss as coincidence. I'm going to speak to them clearly, plainly, the way a mother should be able to speak to her children. Lord Mountbatten's spirit flickered with agitation. Diana, you're talking about breaking fundamental laws of nature. The living and the dead aren't meant to communicate so directly. There are protections in place, barriers that exist to prevent the kind of chaos that would result if... I don't care about chaos. Diana's voice rang through the room with such force that Thomas felt the walls vibrate around him. I care about my sons. I care about the fact that William is slowly drowning under the weight of a crown he never wanted, that he's becoming just another victim of the system that destroyed his parents' marriage. I care about Harry, who's so lost and angry that he's thrown away everything I taught him about family and forgiveness. I care about the grandchildren I'll never get to hold, who are growing up in the shadow of a tragedy that could have been prevented if someone had just had the courage to tell the truth. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, and Thomas's breath came out in thick clouds. Ice began to form on the windows, creating delicate crystal patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Diana's emotions. The truth, King George VI said quietly, is often more terrible than the lies people tell to protect themselves from it. Diana whirled to face him, her form blazing even brighter. The truth is that I didn't die because I was in love with Dodi Fayed. I didn't die because I was reckless or because I failed to wear a seatbelt. I died because there are forces in this world that will stop at nothing to protect their power, and I had become too dangerous to be allowed to live. Thomas felt his legs go weak. He grabbed the doorframe for support as the implications of what Diana was saying hit him. Was she suggesting that her death hadn't been an accident? That the conspiracy theories that had circulated for years might actually contain elements of truth? And that's precisely why you mustn't interfere, Lord Mountbatten said urgently. Those same forces still exist, Diana. They're still watching, still protecting their interests. If you reveal yourself to William and Harry, if you start them asking questions that were supposed to have been buried with you, you'll be putting them in the same danger you faced. Diana moved to the window, pressing both hands against the glass. The ice pattern spread outward from her touch, creating intricate designs that looked almost like words in a language Thomas couldn't read. They're already in danger, she said softly. Every day they live with the lies. Every day they blame themselves for things that were never their fault. They're being destroyed just as surely as if someone put a gun to their heads. At least if they know the truth, they can protect themselves. They can make informed choices about who to trust and who to fear. The mirror behind her began to ripple more violently, and new images appeared on its surface. Thomas saw flashes of scenes he didn't recognize. Shadowy figures in expensive suits having heated conversations. Documents being shredded and burned. Phone calls made in the middle of the night. The images were fragmented and unclear, but they carried an unmistakable sense of conspiracy and cover-up. Show them, Diana commanded, gesturing toward the mirror. Show them what really happened that night in Paris. Show them who was making the decisions that led to my death. Diana, no! Both male figures shouted in unison, but it was too late. The mirror's surface exploded with light, and suddenly Thomas was no longer standing in a room at Kensington Palace. He was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dark and terrifying, where the dead could show him glimpses of truths that the living were never meant to see. He saw a hotel room in Paris where men in expensive suits were having a heated argument about the Diana problem. He saw phone calls being made to various contacts around the world, resources being mobilized, contingency plans being put into motion. He saw a flash of twisted metal and broken glass, but from a perspective that suggested someone had been watching the crash site before the emergency responders arrived. The visions came fast and fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across decades. Thomas saw connections between seemingly unrelated events, patterns of influence and control that stretched from the palaces of London to the corridors of power in Washington and beyond. He saw the faces of people he recognized from newspapers and television, their expressions cold and calculating as they discussed acceptable losses and necessary sacrifices. But most terrifyingly of all, he saw that the conspiracy Diana had uncovered wasn't limited to her own death. It was ongoing, evolving, adapting to new threats and new challenges. William and Harry weren't just dealing with the aftermath of their mother's murder, They were potential targets themselves, their every move being watched and evaluated by forces that viewed them as either assets to be controlled or obstacles to be eliminated. The visions ended as abruptly as they had begun, leaving Thomas gasping and disoriented in the suddenly quiet room. Diana's spirit had dimmed considerably, as if showing him those images had cost her tremendous energy. The two male figures were gone entirely, leaving only wisps of ethereal light where they had been standing. "Now you understand," Diana said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now you know why I can't rest, why I can't move on to whatever comes next. My sons are still in danger, and they don't even know it. They think the threats they face come from tabloid photographers and political opponents, but the real danger comes from the same people who killed me." Thomas found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse croak. "What do you want me to do? I'm just a security guard. No one will believe me if I try to tell them what I've seen." Diana's spirit turned to look at him directly, and for the first time, Thomas felt the full force of her presence focused on him. It was like standing in front of a bonfire made of pure love and determination. "You're not just a security guard, Thomas Mitchell. You're a father, a man who understands what it means to love a child more than your own life. And you're someone who has spent his career seeking justice, protecting the innocent, standing up for what's right even when it's difficult." How did she know his full name? How did she know about his daughter? Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold permeating the room. "Tomorrow night," Diana continued, "I'm going to try to reach my sons directly. I'm going to break through the barriers that separate our worlds and speak to them as clearly as I'm speaking to you now. But I need someone in the living world to help me. Someone who can act as an anchor, a bridge between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living." The implications of what she was asking began to dawn on Thomas. "You want me to help you conduct some kind of seance? To help you communicate with William and Harry from beyond the grave?" Diana shook her head, and despite her ethereal state, Thomas could see a sad smile cross her features. "Not a seance, Thomas. Something far more dangerous and far more real. I'm going to try to manifest myself in their presence, to appear to them as clearly as I'm appearing to you. But such an effort will require enormous energy, and without someone living to help channel and focus that energy, the attempt could tear apart the very fabric that keeps our two worlds separate." The room around them began to fade as Diana's spirit started to dissipate, but her final words echoed clearly in the growing darkness. "Think carefully about what you've seen tonight, Thomas. Tomorrow, you'll have to choose between the safety of ignorance and the terrible responsibility that comes with truth. Choose wisely, because the fate of my sons, and possibly the future of the monarchy itself, may depend on your decision." As the supernatural light finally faded completely, Thomas found himself standing alone in the cold, empty room. But this time, he wasn't the same man who had entered. He was someone who had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of history, someone who now carried knowledge that felt like both a gift and a curse. He left the room in a daze, his mind reeling with everything he had seen and heard. As he continued his rounds, Thomas couldn't help but wonder if he was being watched by more than just security cameras. If Diana's claims were true, if there truly were forces that would kill to protect their secrets, then simply witnessing these supernatural encounters might have put him in mortal danger. But as he thought about his own daughter sleeping safely in her bed across London, Thomas realized that some risks were worth taking. Some truths were worth fighting for, no matter how dangerous they might be. And if a mother's love could reach across the barrier between life and death, then maybe it was strong enough to finally bring justice to those who thought they were above the law. Tomorrow night would bring the ultimate test. Tomorrow night, Thomas would have to decide whether he was brave enough to help a dead princess save her living sons from the same forces that had destroyed her. The very thought terrified him, but walking away wasn't an option anymore. He had seen too much, learned too much, and felt too deeply the desperate love of a mother who refused to let death silence her voice. As dawn broke over London, Thomas drove home knowing that his life had irrevocably changed. He was no longer just a witness to the impossible. He was about to become a participant in events that would either change the world forever or destroy everyone involved in the attempt. Thomas spent the third day in a state of nervous exhaustion, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything except the impossible decision that lay before him. He had called in sick to work, something he had never done in his 12 years at the palace, and spent the morning walking aimlessly through the streets of London, trying to make sense of everything he had witnessed. By afternoon, he found himself standing outside St. Paul's Cathedral, staring up at the massive dome where Diana and Charles had been married 43 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, contemplating whether to help the spirit of a woman who had died tragically young communicate with the sons she had left behind, while standing in the very place where her fairy tale had begun. But it hadn't been a fairy tale, had it? It had been a carefully orchestrated political alliance that had trapped a young woman in a life of scrutiny and loneliness, eventually leading to her death when she threatened to expose the very system that had created her. If Diana's claims were true, if she really had been murdered because she posed a threat to powerful interests, then her story was more of a horror tale than a romance. Thomas pulled out his phone and stared at his daughter Sarah's contact information. She was 25 now, working as a nurse at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, living her own life and building her own future. What would she think if she knew her father was contemplating in what could only be described as supernatural intervention in royal affairs? Would she think he had lost his mind? Or would she understand that sometimes ordinary people were called upon to do extraordinary things? As evening approached, Thomas made his decision. He couldn't walk away from what he had witnessed, couldn't ignore the desperate love of a mother trying to protect her children from beyond the grave. If there was even a chance that Diana's spirit could reach William and Harry, could finally give them the answers they had been seeking for nearly 3 decades, then he had to help make it happen. He arrived at Kensington Palace an hour before his shift was scheduled to begin, his stomach churning with anxiety and anticipation. Sarah was waiting for him in the security office, her expression concerned. "Tom, you look terrible. Are you sure you're well enough to work tonight? I can cover your section if you need to go home." Thomas forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just had a rough day. Sometimes the anniversary of difficult events hits you harder than you expect." It wasn't entirely a lie. The anniversary of Diana's death was still months away, but the weight of her unfinished business had been pressing on him for 3 days now, making him feel as though he were carrying the grief of the entire royal family on his shoulders. Sarah studied his face carefully. "Is there something you want to tell me, Tom? In all the years we've worked together, I've never seen you like this. If something is bothering you, you know you can trust me." For a moment, Thomas was tempted to confess everything. Sarah was intelligent, experienced, and discreet. If anyone could help him process what he had witnessed, it would be her. But the memory of Diana's warnings about dangerous forces still watching and waiting held him back. The less Sarah knew, the safer she would be. "Just personal stuff," he said finally. "Nothing to do with work." Sarah nodded, but Thomas could tell she wasn't convinced. She had the instincts of someone who had spent decades reading people and situations, and she knew when someone was hiding something important. As the evening progressed, Thomas found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his normal duties. Every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose, and the very air inside the palace felt charged with electricity. The other security staff noticed his agitation, but attributed it to stress or illness, and gave him space to work through whatever was bothering him. At 11:15 p.m., Thomas couldn't wait any longer. He started his rounds early, his footsteps echoing through the corridors as he made his way toward the West Wing. Tonight felt different from the previous 2 nights. There was an energy building in the palace that seemed to emanate from every stone in the walls, as if the building itself was preparing for something momentous. As he approached Diana's corridor, Thomas could see that the temperature had already dropped significantly. His breath misted in the air, and frost was beginning to form on the windows and picture frames lining the hallway. But this time the cold wasn't uncomfortable. It felt purposeful, controlled, like the focused energy of someone gathering strength for a tremendous effort. The door to Diana's room was already open when Thomas arrived, and the supernatural light pouring out was brighter and more intense than he had ever seen it. As he stepped inside, he found himself in the middle of what could only be described as a supernatural war council. Diana's spirit was there, but she was no longer alone. The room was filled with ethereal figures, men and women in clothing from different eras, all bearing the unmistakable bearing of royalty. Thomas recognized some of them from portraits he had seen around the palace. Queen Victoria, her stern expression softened by obvious concern. King George V, still commanding even in death. Queen Mary, elegant and regal despite her translucent state. But most shocking of all was the figure standing directly beside Diana, Queen Elizabeth II herself, her familiar features unmistakable even in her ethereal form. Thomas's knees nearly buckled as he realized that the Queen, who had died just 2 years earlier, was actively participating in this supernatural intervention.
"Grandmother," Diana was saying, her voice filled with both respect and determination, "you know this is the right thing to do. You've watched your grandson struggle with questions that have no answers, carrying guilt that isn't theirs to bear.
They need to know the truth, not just about my death, but about the forces that still threaten them." Queen Elizabeth's spirit nodded slowly, her expression grave. "I have indeed watched them suffer, Diana, and I have come to realize that some of the decisions made during my lifetime, some of the compromises I accepted in the name of stability and tradition, may have done more harm than good. If there is a chance to give William and Harry the peace they deserve, then I support your efforts." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the historical significance of what he was witnessing. The collected spirits of the British royal family gathered together to support Diana's desperate attempt to reach her living sons. It was like being present at a cosmic family meeting where the stakes were nothing less than the future of the monarchy itself. Queen Victoria stepped forward, her diminutive stature somehow commanding despite her ethereal state. "Child," she said, addressing Diana with the authority of someone who had ruled an empire, "what you are attempting has never been done before. To manifest yourself so clearly to the living, to break through the barriers that separate our worlds so completely, requires enormous energy and carries tremendous risks. Are you certain you are prepared for the consequences?" Diana's spirit blazed brighter, her determination making the very air around her shimmer with power. "I've been preparing for 3 days, Majesty. I've gathered energy from every source available to me, and I've studied the barriers between worlds until I understand exactly how to break through them. Tonight, I will speak to my sons as clearly as if I had never died. They will hear my voice, see my face, and finally learn the truth that has been hidden from them for so long." King George V moved closer to the assembled spirits, his military bearing evident even in death. "And what of the living man who has been witnessing these preparations? What role does he play in your plan?" All of the royal spirits turned to look at Thomas, and he felt the weight of their collective attention like a physical force. Diana's spirit approached him, her ethereal form radiating warmth and compassion. "Thomas Mitchell," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you have been chosen for this task because you understand the love of a parent, because you have spent your life protecting others, and because you have the strength to witness truths that would break most people's minds. Tonight, I need you to be my anchor in the living world, to help channel and focus the energy required for me to manifest myself to William and Harry." Thomas found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Diana gestured toward the large mirror that dominated one wall of the room. The surface was rippling more violently than ever, showing fragmented images of various locations around London, Clarence House where William lived, Harry's residence in Montecito, and dozens of other places that seemed to flicker in and out of focus. "William is dining with Catherine and the children tonight at Adelaide Cottage," Diana explained. "Harry is in his study in California, working on his memoir. At exactly midnight, I'm going to attempt to manifest myself simultaneously in both locations. But to do so, I need someone living, to serve as a conduit, to help me bridge the gap between the world of the dead and the world of the living." Thomas felt his heart racing as the implications became clear. "You want me to somehow channel your spirit? To help you appear to your sons?" Queen Elizabeth stepped forward, her expression serious. "Mr. Mitchell, what Diana is asking of you is not without danger. Serving as a bridge between worlds can have lasting effects on a living person. You may find yourself changed by the experience, able to see and hear things that most people cannot. Are you willing to accept those consequences?" Thomas thought of his daughter, of the life he had built for himself, of the comfortable routine that would be shattered forever if he agreed to participate in this supernatural intervention. But then he thought of William and Harry, 2 men who had spent their entire adult lives wondering if they could have done something to save their mother, carrying the weight of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. "I'm willing," he said finally, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Diana's spirit brightened with gratitude and relief.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for being brave enough to help a mother reach her children one last time. She moved to the center of the room, and the other royal spirits arranged themselves in a circle around her. Thomas could feel energy building in the space between them, a power that made his hair stand on end and his vision blur at the edges. "Take my hands," Diana instructed, extending her ethereal arms toward him. Thomas hesitated for just a moment, then reached out to grasp what should have been empty air. To his amazement, he could feel her hands, not solid like living flesh, but present nonetheless, warm and comforting and somehow more real than anything he had ever touched. The moment their hands connected, Thomas felt a surge of energy that nearly knocked him unconscious. Images flooded his mind. Not just memories of Diana's life, but impressions of her death, her years of existence as a spirit, her constant vigil over her sons. He saw William's wedding day through her eyes, felt her joy at seeing him find love with Catherine. He experienced her heartbreak as she watched Harry struggle with anger and loss, felt her desperate desire to comfort him when he felt most alone. But he also saw darker things, shadowy figures who had orchestrated her death, ongoing conspiracies that threatened her sons, forces of power and greed that viewed the royal family as either tools to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. The truth was more complex and more terrifying than even the wildest conspiracy theories had suggested. As the energy continued to build, Thomas felt himself becoming a conduit for something vast and powerful. The other royal spirits began to glow brighter, adding their own energy to Diana's desperate attempt. The mirror on the wall exploded with light, its surface becoming a window into multiple locations simultaneously. Through the supernatural portal, Thomas could see William sitting in his private study at Adelaide Cottage, working late into the evening on official correspondence. In another section of the mirror, Harry was indeed in his study in California, but he wasn't working on his memoir. He was staring at a framed photograph of his mother, tears streaming down his face. "Now," Diana said, her voice filled with power and determination. "Help me reach them now." Thomas felt energy pour through him like electricity, using his living essence as a bridge between worlds. For a terrifying moment, he thought he might be torn apart by the supernatural forces flowing through his body. But then he felt the collective strength of the royal spirits supporting him, lending him their power and protection. The mirror's surface rippled one final time, and then Diana's spirit began to fade from the room at Kensington Palace. But Thomas could see her clearly in both locations, shown in the mirror, standing behind William in his study, placing a translucent hand on his shoulder, and materializing in Harry's study in California with such clarity that she looked almost solid. Both princes felt her presence immediately. William's head snapped up from his paperwork, his eyes widening in shock as he turned to see his mother's spirit standing behind him. In California, Harry dropped the photograph he had been holding, his face going pale, as Diana's familiar form appeared before him. "My darling boys," Diana's voice echoed simultaneously in both locations, as clear and warm as if she had never died. "Please don't be afraid. I know this is impossible, but I needed to see you, to tell you things that should have been said long ago." Thomas watched through the mirror as both princes struggled to process what they were seeing. William reached out tentatively, his hand passing through Diana's ethereal form, while Harry simply stared in shock, unable to speak or move.
"You're not going insane," Diana continued gently.
"This is really happening. I am really here, and I have so much to tell you, so many truths that have been hidden for too long." The manifestation lasted for nearly an hour. Thomas watched and listened as Diana finally had the conversation with her sons that death had prevented 27 years earlier. She told them about the forces that had orchestrated her death, the ongoing threats they faced, and most importantly, the fact that nothing that had happened was their fault. She spoke about William's sense of duty and his fear that he was becoming trapped in the same system that had destroyed his parents' marriage. She assured him that his love for Catherine and his children was real and strong enough to overcome any obstacles the monarchy might place in their path. To Harry, she spoke about forgiveness, not of the people who had hurt him, but of himself for the anger he had carried for so long. She told him that his decision to leave England had been brave, not cowardly, and that protecting his own family was exactly what she would have wanted him to do. As the energy finally began to fade and Diana's spirit started to dissipate from both locations, she left her sons with one final message.
Remember that love is stronger than death, stronger than duty, stronger than any force that tries to tear families apart. Take care of each other. Protect each other and never forget that your mother's love surrounds you always. As the manifestation ended completely, Thomas found himself alone in Diana's room at Kensington Palace, physically and emotionally drained, but filled with a sense of completion he had never experienced before. The mirror had returned to normal, showing only his own reflection, but he knew that somewhere in London and California, two princes were sitting in stunned silence, finally understanding truths that would change their lives forever. Thomas left the room, knowing that everything had changed, not just for William and Harry, but for himself as well. He could feel the difference in his perception, could sense things about the world that had previously been invisible to him. The boundary between the living and the dead would never be quite as solid for him as it had been before. As he completed his rounds and prepared to leave the palace, Thomas realized that he was now part of something much larger than himself, a story that would reshape the monarchy, challenge powerful interests, and ultimately determine whether love truly was strong enough to overcome death itself. The fourth day dawned gray and cold over London, but Thomas Mitchell barely noticed the weather as he sat in his kitchen, staring at his hands and wondering if he had imagined the entire supernatural encounter. The rational part of his mind insisted that stress and sleep deprivation had caused him to hallucinate the entire experience, but his body told a different story. He felt fundamentally changed, as if the very cells in his body had been rearranged by the supernatural energy that had flowed through him. His phone had been ringing constantly since early morning, calls from the palace security office, from Sarah, from his supervisor asking why he hadn't reported for debriefing after his shift. But Thomas couldn't bring himself to answer. How could he possibly explain where he had been and what he had done without sounding completely insane? At noon, the calls stopped abruptly, replaced by insistent knocking at his front door. Thomas peered through the peephole to see two men in expensive suits standing on his doorstep, their bearing and demeanor screaming government officials even without visible identification. His blood ran cold as he remembered Diana's warnings about the dangerous forces that had orchestrated her death. "Mr. Mitchell," one of the men called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to speak with you about the events at Kensington Palace last night. Please open the door." Thomas's first instinct was to pretend he wasn't home, but he knew that would only delay the inevitable. If these men represented the same interests that had killed Diana, then running would only make things worse for himself and potentially for his daughter as well. He opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. "I don't know what you're talking about. My shift last night was completely routine." The second man, shorter but somehow more menacing than his colleague, held up a tablet showing security camera footage. Even from Thomas's limited view through the crack in the door, he could see himself entering Diana's room and remaining there for over an hour. "Mr. Mitchell," the first man said patiently, "we have electromagnetic readings that show massive energy discharges in the West Wing last night, all centered on the room you accessed without authorization. We have thermal imaging that shows temperature fluctuations of over 40 degrees in that corridor. And we have satellite data showing unusual electromagnetic activity that coincided exactly with your presence in that room." Thomas felt his heart racing. If they had that much technical evidence, denial was pointless. But admitting the truth could be signing his own death warrant. "May we come in?" the shorter man asked. Though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a request, Thomas reluctantly unlatched the chain and stepped aside, allowing the two men to enter his modest flat. They moved with the efficient confidence of people who were accustomed to taking control of situations, quickly scanning the room and positioning themselves strategically. "My name is Director Harrison," the taller man said, settling into Thomas's armchair as if he owned it. "This is Agent Fowler. We represent a joint task force that monitors unusual activities affecting British national security. Last night's events at Kensington Palace have triggered several of our most sensitive protocols." Agent Fowler remained standing by the window, his position allowing him to watch both Thomas and the street outside. Mr. First proposed, "Mitchell, we know that something extraordinary happened last night. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with our investigation or whether we're going to have to treat you as a potential security threat." Thomas forced himself to remain calm. I don't know what kind of investigation you're conducting, but I was just doing my job. If there were equipment malfunctions or unusual readings, maybe you should be talking to the technical staff instead of a security guard. Director Harrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Mr. Mitchell, let me be very clear about something. The room you entered last night has been under constant surveillance since 1997. Not just standard security monitoring, but specialized detection equipment that measures electromagnetic fields, temperature variations, infrared signatures, and other phenomena that most people don't even know exist. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Last night, every single one of those instruments detected readings that are quite literally off the charts. The energy signatures we recorded were consistent with phenomena that our scientists classify as impossible, the kind of readings we might expect if someone were attempting to breach the barriers between dimensions. Thomas felt his mouth go dry. These weren't just government security officials. They represented some kind of specialized unit that apparently dealt with supernatural events. The implications were staggering. If such a task force existed, it meant the government had been monitoring and potentially covering up paranormal activities for decades. Furthermore, Agent Fowler added from his position by the window, "We have intercepted communications from both Clarence House and California that suggest Prince William and Prince Harry both experienced highly unusual events last night. Events that they are describing to their closest advisors in terms that are remarkably similar to what our instruments recorded at Kensington Palace." Director Harrison pulled out another tablet, this one showing what appeared to be transcripts of phone conversations. Prince William called his private secretary at 1:30 a.m., reporting what he described as an impossible but absolutely real conversation with my mother. Prince Harry placed a similar call to his security chief 45 minutes later, using nearly identical language. Thomas felt the walls closing in around him. If the government had been monitoring the prince's communications closely enough to intercept their private phone calls within hours of Diana's manifestation, then the conspiracy Diana had revealed was even more extensive than he had imagined. "What do you want from me?" he asked, finally abandoning any pretense of ignorance. Director Harrison exchanged a meaningful look with Agent Fowler before continuing. "Mr. Mitchell, what happened last night represents a potential threat to national security on a scale you couldn't possibly comprehend. If word of these events became public, if people began to believe that the dead could communicate with the living, the social and political ramifications would be catastrophic." Agent Fowler moved away from the window, his expression grim. "More specifically, if Princess Diana's spirit has indeed found a way to communicate with her sons, then she may have shared information that was supposed to have died with her. Information about the circumstances of her death that could destabilize not just the monarchy, but the entire global power structure that depends on certain secrets remaining buried." Thomas realized with growing horror that these men weren't just investigating what had happened. They were planning to cover it up, just as they had covered up Diana's murder 27 years earlier. And anyone who threatened their ability to maintain that cover-up would be dealt with accordingly. "I know what you're thinking," Director Harrison said, apparently reading Thomas's expression with practiced ease. "You're wondering if we're the same people who orchestrated Princess Diana's death. The answer is complicated. Some of the individuals who made those decisions are indeed still active in positions of authority. Others have been replaced by new personnel who inherited both their responsibilities and their secrets." Agent Fowler returned to his position by the window, but now he was watching Thomas more intently. "The point is, Mr. Mitchell, that the interests we represent are much larger than any individual government or monarchy. We're talking about global financial networks, military-industrial complexes, intelligence agencies from multiple countries, all working together to maintain stability and order. Princess Diana threatened that stability when she was alive, and if her spirit has found a way to continue threatening it from beyond the grave, then we have a problem that requires immediate resolution." Thomas felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. "So you're admitting that you killed her? That you murdered a mother of two because she was inconvenient for your global conspiracy?" Director Harrison's expression didn't change. "I'm admitting that decisions were made by people who believed they were protecting the greater good. Whether you characterize those decisions as murder or necessary sacrifice is a matter of perspective. The casual callousness of the statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. These people were discussing the death of one of the most beloved figures in modern history as if she were nothing more than a chess piece that had been removed from the board. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Agent Fowler moved closer, his hand resting casually on something concealed beneath his jacket. "That depends entirely on your willingness to cooperate, Mr. Mitchell. We need to know exactly what occurred last night, what information Princess Diana may have shared with her sons, and most importantly, whether you have any ongoing ability to communicate with spirits or facilitate such communications." Thomas realized that his newfound supernatural sensitivity might be the only thing keeping him alive. If these men believed he was the key to preventing future supernatural interventions, they would need to keep him alive and under their control. "I can sense things now," he admitted, deciding that partial truth was his best strategy. "Since last night I can sometimes see and hear things that other people can't. But I don't know how to control it, and I certainly don't know how to summon spirits or facilitate communications." Director Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas carefully. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Keel. Mitchell, because our preliminary analysis suggests that last night's manifestation required enormous energy from both the spiritual realm and the living world. If Princess Diana attempts to contact her sons again, she'll need someone like you to serve as a bridge between worlds." The implication was clear. They wanted to use Thomas to monitor and potentially interfere with any future attempts by Diana to reach William and Harry. They were planning to turn him into a weapon against the very spirits he had helped the night before. "I won't help you hurt her," Thomas said quietly. "I won't help you silence a mother who's trying to protect her children." Agent Fowler's hand moved more obviously toward his concealed weapon. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't think you fully understand the situation you're in. This isn't a negotiation. You will cooperate with our investigation, or you will be treated as a clear and present danger to national security." Before Thomas could respond, the temperature in his flat dropped precipitously. Frost began forming on the windows, and the lights flickered ominously. Both government agents immediately tensed, their training apparently including protocols for dealing with supernatural encounters. "She's here," Thomas whispered, feeling Diana's presence like a warm embrace despite the freezing air. A translucent figure began to materialize in the center of the room. Not Diana, but Queen Elizabeth II, her expression more stern and commanding than Thomas had ever seen it during her lifetime. The two agents staggered backward, their professional composure cracking in the face of an impossible encounter. "Gentlemen," the Queen's spirit said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had ruled for over 70 years, "I believe you are trespassing on British soil without proper authorization." Director Harrison's face had gone pale, but he managed to maintain his composure. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, you are no longer in a position to grant or deny authorization for anything." The Queen's spirit blazed brighter, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. "On the contrary, Director Harrison, death has freed me from the political constraints that limited my actions during life. I am no longer required to remain neutral in matters affecting the safety and well-being of my family." Agent Fowler was struggling to draw his weapon, but his hands appeared to be frozen in place by some invisible force. The Queen's spirit turned her attention to him with obvious disdain. "Agent Fowler, you will find that your weapons are useless against opponents who have already died. However, your vulnerable status as a living being makes you considerably more fragile than you might wish." Thomas watched in amazement as the two government agents, men who had seemed completely in control just moments earlier, found themselves utterly helpless in the face of royal supernatural intervention. "Your Majesty," Director Harrison said, his voice carefully controlled, "we represent legitimate security interests. Princess Diana's recent activities pose a genuine threat to global stability. Surely you understand the need to maintain certain secrets for the greater good." The Queen's spirit moved closer to him, her ethereal form radiating power and righteous anger. "The greater good? You murdered my daughter-in-law because she threatened your profits and your power. You have spent nearly 3 decades covering up that crime, allowing my grandsons to suffer with guilt and unanswered questions. And now you have the audacity to invoke the greater good? Thomas realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in British history, the spirit of a deceased monarch directly confronting the shadow government that had operated behind the scenes throughout her reign. The implications were staggering. Furthermore, the Queen continued, "Your presence here tonight confirms what Diana suspected during her lifetime, that the forces responsible for her death are still active, still monitoring the royal family, still prepared to eliminate anyone who threatens their interests." The temperature in the room suddenly returned to normal, but the two agents remained frozen in place as if held by invisible bonds. The Queen's spirit turned to address Thomas directly. "Mr. Mitchell, you have been placed in an extraordinarily difficult position. These men represent interests that will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. However, you also have protection that they cannot overcome or eliminate. The collective power of the royal spirits who now understand the full extent of the conspiracy that has operated within our realm." Director Harrison found his voice again, though it sounded strained. "Your Majesty, even if you can protect Mr. Mitchell temporarily, you cannot watch over him every moment of every day. And you certainly cannot protect his daughter, or his friends, or anyone else he cares about." The threat was explicit and chilling, but the Queen's spirit seemed unmoved by it. "Agent Fowler, Director Harrison, you are laboring under a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of death and the power it grants to those who experience it. We are no longer bound by the physical laws that constrain the living. We can be anywhere, see anything, influence events in ways that your science cannot begin to comprehend." She gestured toward the window, and suddenly the glass became transparent in a way that seemed to show not just the street outside, but locations around the world. Thomas could see his daughter at the hospital where she worked, Prince William at Clarence House, Prince Harry in California, and dozens of other people in places that seemed to flicker in and out of focus. Every person you might threaten, every location you might target, every action you might take, all of it is now under the surveillance of spirits who have nothing to lose and everything to protect. Your power was always based on your ability to operate in secrecy, to strike from the shadows without consequence. But there are no shadows that can hide you from the dead. The window returned to normal, but the message was clear. The royal spirits now had the ability to monitor and potentially interfere with the shadow government's activities on a global scale. Agent Fowler managed to speak, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want from us?" The Queen's spirit smiled, and for the first time since her manifestation began, the expression was more sad than angry. "We want justice, Agent Fowler. We want the truth about Diana's death to be revealed to the world. We want the people responsible to face consequences for their actions. And we want the ongoing threats against William and Harry to end permanently." Director Harrison shook his head. "That's impossible. The revelations you're demanding would bring down governments, collapse financial markets, destabilize global security arrangements that have been decades in the making. The cure would be worse than the disease." The Queen's spirit moved to stand directly in front of him, her ethereal form blazing with power and determination. "Then perhaps it's time for those governments and markets and security arrangements to fall, Director Harrison. Perhaps the world would be better served by truth than by the elaborate lies you've constructed to protect your power." The confrontation continued for another hour, with the Queen's spirit calmly dismantling every argument and threat the two agents presented. By the end, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted fundamentally. The shadow government that had operated with impunity for decades now found itself under supernatural surveillance, their every move monitored by opponents they couldn't threaten, couldn't eliminate, and couldn't escape. As the agents finally left Thomas's flat, moving like sleepwalkers under some form of ethereal compulsion, the Queen's spirit turned to address him one final time. "Mr. Mitchell, your role in these events is far from over. Diana's manifestation to her sons was just the beginning. The truth about her death must be revealed to the world, and you will play a crucial part in making that happen. Are you prepared for what's to come?" Thomas thought about his quiet life, his comfortable routines, the simple existence he had built for himself after retiring from the police. All of that was gone now, replaced by something far more dangerous, but infinitely more important. "I'm ready, Your Majesty," he said, and meant it. As the Queen's spirit began to fade, her final words echoed in the growing silence. "Then let us begin to bring justice to those who thought they were above the law. The dead have a very long memory and an even longer reach." Thomas spent the rest of the day preparing for a future he couldn't fully comprehend, but knew he couldn't avoid. The supernatural forces that had been unleashed at Kensington Palace were just the beginning of a reckoning that would shake the foundations of power around the world. Somewhere in London and California, two princes were processing the impossible revelation that their mother's spirit had reached out to them from beyond the grave. Somewhere in government facilities around the world, officials were scrambling to respond to a threat they had never imagined possible. And somewhere in the space between life and death, a mother's love was gathering strength for the final battle to protect her children and reveal the truth that had been hidden for too long. The story that had begun with a security guard noticing an unusual light beneath a door was about to become the most significant supernatural intervention in human history. Thomas Mitchell had helped a dead princess speak to her living sons, and in doing so, had set in motion events that would change the world forever. As night fell over London, Thomas prepared for his return to Kensington Palace, knowing that his final shift as an ordinary security guard was about to begin. Tomorrow, he would become something else entirely: a bridge between worlds, a guardian of supernatural secrets, and a key player in a cosmic battle between truth and deception. The dead were no longer silent, and the living would never be the same.